just highlight something here. Verse 8, he, that is God, gave Abraham the covenant of circumcision. And if I may briefly read from Genesis chapter 17, the New English translation rightly has the title, The Sign of the Covenant. So this is the story Stephen is relating here, or part of the story, about this covenant, this contract, if you will, relationship that is being formed between God and Abraham. And in this story in Genesis 17, it talks about how God changed the name of Abraham to Abraham, as you can see there in verse 5, because I will make you the father of a multitude of nations. So through Abraham, God will redeem all peoples from all the nations of the world. So this is what I call the widescreen gospel. It's not just about the nation of Israel. It's not just about the church. It's about all the nations. It's about the whole world. Of course, the Bible story is focused on that nation of Israel, and then the focus shifts, if you will, to the international church that we talk about. Galatians 6, for example, if you read that, verse 16, the Israel of God, and so forth. But I like to focus on the circumcision aspect of Stephen's speech, Anthony. So there's a big promise here from God to Abraham, or Abraham, to make him fruitful, the father of many nations. That's what the name Abraham means. Names are very important in the Bible because they at many times have significance, have meaning. It goes beyond the name, if you will, to lots of other meanings. And then look at this, verse 9. Then God said to Abraham, as for you, that is Abraham, must keep the covenantal requirement. So that's a qualification. This covenant is qualified. In other words, this covenant is not just, here you go, it's a free gift, no strings attached. No, there's a requirement specific to this. This is my requirement, verse 10, that you and your descendants after you must keep, every male among you must be circumcised. You must circumcise the flesh of your foreskins. This will be a reminder of the covenant between me and you. In other words, the requirement of the gospel, the good news of the inheriting of the land, the fact that you will be fruitful and multiply, the one requirement is this circumcision of the flesh, not only for Abraham, but your descendants. In other words, the seed of Abraham. If this is the case, there it is in black and white. Okay, and this requirement is forever, right? The laws of God are forever. The sign of my covenant will be visible in your flesh. You see there, verse 13, as a permanent reminder. Any uncircumcised male who has not been circumcised in the flesh of his foreskin will be cut off. In other words, you will not inherit the kingdom, the land. Okay. How should we understand this now, Anthony? Because Christians do not follow this practice. There are very few what we call Sabbatarians. There are very few Christians who keep things like the Sabbath or food laws that I've met in my short life. I can count them in my hand, maybe 5, 6, who do preach and practice circumcision of the flesh. Because they have a concept that the church is supposed to continue commandments and laws that are forever. Because that's what it says. It's permanent. So how should we understand this issue of circumcision in connection to the gospel message and the whole focus on the kingdom?
Well, we would have always to go to Galatians chapter 3, verses 19 and following, where Paul is discussing this very issue. It's true that physical circumcision was commanded for Abraham and his descendants forever. However, there is the fact that we are not under that old covenant in the letter. So Paul is the exponent of the new covenant, and Jesus also. And Paul in Galatians 3 says that circumcision in the flesh means nothing. under the new covenant. So if one doesn't understand that the new covenant is a spiritualization, if you like, of the old covenant in the letter, one hasn't understood the story at all well. So that's the quick answer to that. I will also point this out, Carlos, that the physical circumcision command that you're just referring to there was given to Abraham after he had believed the promise. So more important than the physical circumcision, important though that was under the old covenant, more important was the belief in the gospel as preached to Abraham. That preceded the physical circumcision. So yes, physical circumcision was required under the old covenant, but under the new covenant, it's been spiritualized. Hence, Paul, who was not a false prophet, who himself was a Jew and an exponent of the new covenant in the letter, Paul says, physical circumcision means absolutely nothing now under the new covenant. It meant everything under the old covenant in the letter, but don't confuse the two covenants. Paul then and Jesus are ministers of the new covenant, and they spiritualize physical circumcisions. That's
Right.
one.
My other point is this, Anthony. Those Christians I mentioned that we call Sabbatarians,
Yes.
so Christians who continue to keep certain aspects of the Mosaic system,
Yes.
the law of Moses, as it's known in the Bible, by the way, 20 plus times. Jesus himself talks about the law of Moses.
Mhm.
So those Christians who continue food laws,
Mm.
typically the Sabbath, I always find an inconsistency
Yes.
in that because one of the arguments is, look, the Sabbath was forever.
Mhm.
Well, the sign of the circumcision, which
Yes.
comes before the Sabbath, which comes before Sinai, seems to
Yes.
me rather more important of a
Yes.
law that
Yes.
is permanent. So my question, as
Yeah.
a rhetorical question, is it inconsistent to follow certain systems of that law of Moses, the Torah, yet not preach and practice circumcision of the flesh? I mean,
I think it's
why do
entirely
they do it?
inconsistent. Absolutely. And that's a good question to ask these people. Are they, the Jewish roots people, insisting on physical circumcision? And the answer is they're not. That's entirely consistent. It's got to be one thing or the other. If you're going to insist on the letter of the old covenant, you're going to have to insist on physical circumcision. Although Paul himself said, and I quote now from Galatians chapter 5, Paul said, if I were still preaching physical circumcision, why am I being persecuted? That is absolute proof positive that Paul was not, I repeat, not preaching physical circumcision.
See, the other thing, Anthony, is
Mm.
that they actually, the early church actually discussed this matter,
Yes, of course.
right? When they saw so many of us so-called Gentiles coming in, foreigners, if you will,
Yes.
they're coming into the church. They want part of this gospel. They want to be part of it. Oh,
Yes.
wow, there's a kingdom coming. Jesus is the king of that coming kingdom. He was
Mhm.
raised from the dead. We want to be part of this, right?
Absolutely, of
And
course.
so they actually discussed the situation in Acts 15 in relation to the circumcision. So it says that some believing Pharisees, so many Pharisees came to faith.
Yes.
We know that in the Gospels, Pharisees are by and large portrayed negatively, they're unbelievers. But here it says the religious party of the Pharisees who had believed, so that's
Yep.
good. And they ask a question that I think, Anthony, is very relevant
Yes, of course.
and very, if you will, logical.
Of course it was. Yes.
They say, is it necessary to circumcise the Gentiles and to order them, in
Yes.
other words, command them to observe, keep the law of
Of
Moses?
course.
It sounds like to me, Anthony, that if you will, the gateway, the door to keeping the law of Moses
Yes.
is physical circumcision.
Of course.
So again, I asked the question as a rhetorical question for viewers, listeners out there who are being told to keep the Sabbath, to keep
Mhm.
food laws. What part of this am I wrong in? Because I see an inconsistency here. If I want to keep the law, I have to get circumcised in the flesh. Am I wrong here, Anthony?
No, it's quite clear, and that is not a question there that you had on the screen. It's a statement. These people, false teachers, were saying it is necessary, not is it, but it is necessary to circumcise the Gentiles in the flesh, that is, and to tell them to keep the law of Moses. That was a major error. And Paul then corrects that major error by spiritualizing physical circumcision. I repeat the point that circumcision was commanded even to Abraham after he had believed. In Genesis 12 and 15, he believed the gospel about progeny and prosperity, and all the good things that come with the Abrahamic covenant. It was only after that faith, believing the gospel, that the physical circumcision was added to it. So it's secondary even there. So we find then that Paul says in the New Testament that he circumcised Timothy, who had a Jewish mother, I think. He circumcised Timothy. Why? Because of the Jews, as a concession. He said, all right, I don't object to doing this physical circumcision if it keeps you happy. But he absolutely says that physical circumcision is not necessary for anyone, Jew or Gentile, under the new covenant. Yeah.
Yeah, what's striking, Anthony, is that once they get together, they discuss the matter,
Mm-hmm.
they write this letter described here in Acts 15 from the apostles,
Yes.
elders, your brothers, to us Gentile brothers and sisters, right?
Mm-hmm.
This verse here, verse 28, strikes me as amazing. It says, "For it seemed best to the Holy Spirit and to us." Wait a minute. I just read Genesis 17. God was very clear there,
Yes,
very explicit, very detailed. But now the Holy Spirit, that in other words, God,
yes,
seems to be changing
of
what
course
was
it is.
previously told to Israel
Yes,
as something unchanging.
it
How do
is.
we?
Well, I mean, it's just a fact. You stated the fact. We don't want to lay a greater burden. So there's the implication there that the law of Moses in the letter, a blessing as it was in some, certainly in some sense, is still a burden. Not to place any greater burden. We don't want to burden people with physical circumcision.
Wait a minute. Circumcision of the flesh.
Yes,
I just read Genesis 17,
yes,
but now it's a burden.
of course.
How's that? See, my thing is, Anthony,
Yeah,
that we keep hearing. I mean, you grew up in this system of Sabbath keeping and stuff.
yes,
I,
yes,
I keep being told, look, the laws are forever. God gave these laws,
yeah,
Sabbath laws, food laws, etc. You, Carlos, are saying they're burdensome.
yes,
They're a yoke. How dare
yes,
you? You know, God does not change. Do you think God changes? So we're
yes,
always challenged by these arguments. But when we read the text here and this incredible letter, first of all, okay, so the Holy Spirit, God, seems to be changing something he said wasn't changing in
yes,
Genesis 17.
of
And
course.
now you highlight the fact that the very Holy Spirit and the apostles and elders of Jerusalem are saying
Yes,
that sign of the covenant is a
yes,
burden.
absolutely is.
How can this be?
Well, because the new covenant is not the same as the old, and God has every right to introduce a new covenant. And under the new covenant, it is a burden to go back under the old covenant. That's entirely reasonable. The forever phrase in the Old Testament means as long as the conditions are relevant. What if the conditions change as they do under the new covenant? Then, of course, as you use
Yeah,
that
but God
text in
doesn't
Hebrews,
change.
it changed. It has been changed, but you use that
Anyway,
text in Hebrews, which says
Hebrews
that
7:12.
there needed to
Yeah,
be a change of the law. So does God change? The answer is yes. In that regard, he does. And there's
right.
another text in Acts 15 which says that the old covenant was actually a burden. We had it, but there's a stronger one, isn't there? Even our fathers couldn't bear that. So the old covenant was a mixed blessing, certainly, and it's changed.